Hello, and thank you for joining us for this webinar event, Racial Disparity and its Impact on Student Loan Borrowing. This convening is brought to you by the Urban League of Greater Madison, the Wisconsin Coalition on Student Debt, and the Center for Financial Security here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. My name is Hallie Leinhardt, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Center for Financial Security. Our webinar event today will run from 11 to 1 p.m. Central Time, beginning with a few words of welcome from our coalition leadership. We will then hear presentations from two speakers who have studied the topic of racial disparity in student loan debt. These presentations will have opportunity for audience Q&A following each presenter. We will then move into the second hour of the webinar event with a panel discussion by three community leaders working in this space. Following the panel, we will again have time for Q&A from the audience. Please feel free to submit questions in the question chat box located at the right side of your screen throughout the webinar. As I mentioned, we will be pausing to ask questions of those presenters and panelists throughout the 2 hours of our event. Please note that the webinar is being recorded today, and we will post the recording on our website with the slides within 1 business day. I'm very happy to now introduce Laura Sutherland, Administrator of the Division of Trade and Consumer Protection at the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, who will provide us with some opening remarks. Thank you, Laura.
Thanks, Hallie. Hello and good morning and welcome to everybody. Again, my name is Laura Sutherland and I'm the Administrator of the Division of Trade and Consumer Protection at DAGCAP. I'm also a board member of the Wisconsin Coalition on Student Debt. And together with the Urban League of Greater Wisconsin, we're pleased to put on this convening about the disparate impacts of student loan borrowing and debt on people and communities of color, particularly in Wisconsin communities. I plan to tell you a little about the coalition and about the Urban League and the purpose of this convening today. But first, I want to mark the tragic loss of life last night in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and the repugnant shooting of Jacob Blake Sunday night. The ramification of our country's institutional racism is extensive, it's complex and deep-seated, and will take us, all of us working together to effect meaningful change. Today's discussion about one of the many economic effects on structural racism, while an important one, is modest compared to the fight for living with dignity and without fear of bodily harm that is happening in our streets today. So with that, we appreciate your attendance today and we appreciate your willingness to engage in what we hope to be an important discussion and a long journey to address the economic racial disparities in our country, in our state, and in particularly today's conversation, the student debt space. So co-hosting today's convening is one of the most significant, important, and knowledgeable voices on these issues, the Urban League of Greater Wisconsin. The League's mission is to ensure that African Americans and other community members are educated, employed, and empowered to live well, advance professionally, and contribute to the common good in the 21st century. Led by President and CEO Dr. Ruben Anthony, the Urban League offers an array of programs for youth, adults, and families, including in those are college, career, and community readiness programs for middle and high school youth, job training and placement programs for unemployed and underemployed adults, homeownership and financial empowerment programs for families, civil rights, social justice, and other engagement initiatives in the community. The coalition is honored to be co-hosting this event with them this morning. The Wisconsin Coalition on Student Debt is a nonprofit organization representing a range of concerned organizations and stakeholders who seek to increase clarity around the key issues of student debt, college affordability, and loan repayment. As a nonpartisan group, the coalition is not an advocacy organization. Instead, we raise awareness of policy insights and promote outreach that improves the borrowing repayment experience of Wisconsin residents with the goal of improved financial outcomes. The coalition's goals are to increase understanding among Wisconsin policymakers and stakeholders of the beneficial strategies and practices around student debt, to facilitate Wisconsin community-based financial counseling and workshops by working with community groups and financial counseling experts that connect information and resources with the community members who need them, and to foster greater transparency and dialogue around the challenges and solutions for minimizing and managing student loan debt in Wisconsin. Today, to that end, today's convening is the first part in what we hope to be many convenings discussing important, complex, and timely topics related to student debt. Student loan debt has grown over $1.7 trillion in the United States. Over 45 million Americans have student loans, and over 9 million, 20% student loan borrowers are in default. Student loans significantly impede people's ability to save for retirement, buy a home, or start a family or business. The burden and the impact of student loan debt disproportionately affects borrowers of color. And this burden is exponentially exacerbated by the recent COVID crisis. This event is intended to be a local discussion about the disparate impacts of the crushing student loan debt it's having on Wisconsin communities of color. We've assembled an incredible subject matter experts and leaders from Wisconsin and elsewhere to present, answer questions, and enter into a dialogue about this issue. Again, we appreciate your time and attention and concern about this topic, and we're hopeful our discussions will provide a platform for needed action. With that, I will turn this platform back over to Hallie Leinhart, the Assistant Director of the Center for Financial Security at the University of Wisconsin. We are extremely grateful for CFS's willingness to provide this platform and Hallie's willingness to lend her expertise in facilitating this important discussion. And we also appreciate the speakers and the community leaders willing to participate and lead this conversation today. So thank you very much for attending, and thank you, Hallie.
And thank you, Laura. Thanks very much for that thoughtful welcome. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's event. Fenaba Addo is an Associate Professor of Consumer Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Catherine Welbeck is Civil Rights Counsel at the Student Borrower Protection Center. Our panelists that we will hear from in the second hour of the event are Kiamani Alford, who is Dean of Student Access and Success at Madison College. Jocelyn Diaz-Valdez is Senior Advisor for the Office of Student Financial Aid at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And Langston Evans is AVID District Coordinator at Madison Metropolitan School District. Thank you all for being here. And with that, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to our first speaker, Fenaba Addo. And Fenaba, I will be forwarding slides, so please feel free to prompt me when you would like to move to the next slide.
Thanks, Hallie. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, loud and clear, thanks.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. You can go to the next slide. Hallie? Next slide. This is still panelist.
Let's see, is it going to, on my screen, it's going to the next slide. Student loan debt, high and rising.
I see the panelists, the pictures of the panelists on my screen.
I think, so racial disparities in student debt, there's your first slide. Okay. And then student loan debt, high and rising. So, and I can see that our audience members can also see your slides as I'm moving them. So maybe your screen is just having a lag for some reason.
Okay. Now I see my title slide. Okay, I'll start and then we'll see what happens. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Fenaba Addo. I'm an Associate Professor of Consumer Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So for the past few years, my colleagues and I have been interested in the disproportionate burden of student debt among Black borrowers. Our work has shed light on the increased financial risk of pursuing a college education in a society that has required expensive credentials of populations that are under-resourced, the least wealthy, and face systemic barriers to wealth-building opportunities. So yeah, that one is good. Now I see the student loan debt high and rising. So according to the Federal Reserve Bank, approximately 45 million borrowers owe over $1.7 trillion in aggregate student loan debt. And this is second only to mortgage debt on the household balance sheet. Next slide, please. So over that same period, we see increasing racial disparities in student loan debt, both in the proportion of households that carry loans, as well as the percentage of the household financial debt portfolio that is comprised of student loan debt. While both Black and white rates are both increasing, the rate for Black households is significantly greater than white households and continued post-recession, so the recession which lasted from approximately 2007 to 2009. Next slide, please. We also see that at all levels of higher education, Black students are more likely to borrow for their degrees. Are you able to see that slide?
Yes. Unfortunately, I think it's just on your end, Fenba. I can see it from both the audience view,
Oh boy.
and then also from my view as presenter. So I think it's unfortunately that it's a lag. Okay. And so if you had your slides that you could just go through separately, then maybe the live screen, that would probably be best, just so that you're not thrown off.
Yeah, so I'll just keep saying next slide, knowing what the slide, because I know when the next is coming, and so I'll just, hopefully we'll be on the same pace. So, okay. So at all levels of higher education, Black students are more likely to borrow for their degrees. Next slide. They're also more likely, they also take on more debt for their degrees. So for example, as shown in this chart, Black students compose 12% of all bachelor's degree recipients in the 2015-2016 academic year, and 64%, or almost 2/3 of these graduates had over $30,000 worth of debt, and a third had over $40,000 worth of debt. Next slide. So you can actually go to the next slide, which shows the default rates by race. So student debt default rates are also stratified by race. More than a third of Black borrowers ever defaulted on their loans, compared with 20% of Latinx borrowers, 12% of white borrowers, and 6.5% of Asian American borrowers. Default rates, we also know that default rates for Black borrowers also exceeded white borrowers, independent of whether they completed their study. So a lot of the discussion in both the policy and public discourse has been around non-completers, so people who have no degree and growing amounts of debt. Next slide. So the amount of debt Black borrowers take on for themselves also exceeds other race and ethnicity groups, but so does the amount of debt that they take on for their children and grandchildren's education, which is second to Latinx borrowers. So given the average and median Black or Latinx household tends to have less income and wealth, these larger loan amounts translate to a greater household debt burden. Next slide. In our research, we argue that racial disparities in debt accrual and repayment reflect processes of racialized economic hardship and discrimination that accumulate across the life course for recent cohorts of young adults, and that both existing and historical processes of racial stratification and exclusion compound across the life course to create inequalities in debt and debt burden. So for example, family wealth is a particularly important resource that drives racial disparities in student debt, and a lot of my research has tried to highlight and bring attention to the relationship between racial wealth disparities and accumulating racial disparities in student debt. As college costs have shifted from the government, in particular from states to families, students and their families, a family's ability to pay for college will increase with their wealth position. Next slide.
we are seeing a
graph
of the parental wealth and young adult student loan debt.
Okay. I think I'm connected with you guys now. So in work that we've done, we have found that there's a negative relationship between wealth, parental wealth, and student debt accumulation. As parental wealth increases, student loan debt amount decreases. Next slide. When we disaggregate by race, for white young adults in our sample, you see what you might expect. So as wealth increases, their debt accrual decreases. Whereas for the Black young adults in our sample, we found that wealth was not associated with the amount of debt that their children accumulated. So the parental wealth levels were not statistically significant, right? Black young adults from wealthier families are more indebted than their white peers relative to young Black adults from less wealthy families. Next slide. But you also do not need to look at wealth or only at wealth to uncover these patterns. In this slide, we see that even after adjusting for their expected family contribution and grant aid, college costs comprise a larger proportion of Latinx families' incomes. Next slide. Okay. So here we also know that Black young adults are also more likely to attend underfunded schools, which are associated with higher levels of debt accumulation. So here are two charts from a report that was put out by the United Negro College Fund showing differences in student loan debt accumulation, comparing students who attended historically Black college universities versus non-historically Black college universities. So these institutions tend to have less resources, but they also serve populations that come from households with fewer resources. And so we see a positive association with the amount of student loan debt, the percent of loans the percent of students who take on loans to attend these institutions, and the median loan amount that is borrowed. Next slide, please. We also see that Black young adults are more likely to enroll in expensive for-profit institutions. So in this chart, it shows that although Black students make up about 16% of the undergraduate population in the 2011 and 2012 academic year, they were disproportionately represented among for-profit institutions at both the 2- and 4-year institutional sector level. Next slide, please. We also know that as young adults, Black youth also experience hardship and discrimination in the labor market that makes debt more burdensome to repay. So Black college graduates consistently have higher rates of unemployment or underemployment, defined as holding positions that do not require a college degree, as is shown in these charts. We also know that from experimental research that even among college graduates, Black youth are less likely to obtain job offers and receive offers for lower paying positions with fewer options for career advancements than white college graduates. So these examples that I've highlighted, we believe shed light on how racial disparities in debt are tied to racialized processes that occur prior to college entry, or may be associated and continue throughout the post-secondary educational period when they're enrolled, and continue to manifest upon school leaving. And we argue that racial disparities in debt are large and are increasing across the early adult life course. Next slide. So here, an analysis we conducted on a sample of older millennials, so young adults who were born between 1980 and 1984 and were, predominantly entering into their college years in the early to mid 2000s. We find that Black young adults have about 55% more debt than white young adults, and that the Black-white student loan debt disparity is growing by about 7.2% annually. We find that Black young adult borrowers are paying down their debt at a rate of 2.9% compared with 9.5%, the 9.5% rate for white young adults. So that is to say that Black young adults start their careers with more debt than whites, and that this disparity is growing over time. We also find evidence that this disparity is going largely, as is suggested, that whites are paying down their debt faster. And there's a lot of new and emerging research that is showing the difficulties that Black young adult borrowers are having in the repayment period with regards to issues with default and delinquency, as I referenced earlier. The next slide, please. So what does this all mean? We argue that rising debt may now be a mechanism by which racial inequalities are being reproduced across generations, in particular among recent cohorts of young adults. And in this era of rising costs and the necessity of higher education for social mobility, financial security, and stability, these disparities may have long-term consequences for racial inequalities and wealth. So here I'm presenting a chart that shows racial differences in median net wealth. So wealth being the difference between the total value of one's financial assets minus the total value of one's liabilities or debts. And we see that Black young adults tend to have lower, Black young adults, men and women, tend to have lower median net worth. Latinx young adults tend to fall in between. Black and white young adults tend to have the highest median wealth levels. And from our calculations, we see that that the debt disparities between Black and white young adults, whoever enrolled in institutions of higher education, hold about approximately 10.4% less wealth relative to their white counterparts due to their student loan debt burden. Another way to kind of interpret that is that if we could eliminate the debt disparity between these young adults, then the racial wealth gap would increase by about 10%. Next slide. So this chart here is showing completion rates and differences in net wealth by race and gender. So similar to previous generations, in particular Generation Xers, millennial women have higher graduation rates than men. And we also see that white women have the highest graduation rates, followed by white men. And that the wealth of white female college graduates exceeds Black and Latinx female graduates, but tend to be lower than white men by almost about $20,000. So the gender disparity in college completion is even greater among Black millennials, where Black women completed college at almost twice the rate of Black men. Yet the median wealth of Black male millennials was 2.5 times greater than Black female graduates. And Latinx women and men have the smallest gap in graduation rates with less than a 4% difference. So I think it's also important to highlight the intersectionalities with regard to how these disparities in student loan debt are playing out within young adults and may be tied to this growing student debt burden. Next slide, please. I also often like to show, both when I'm teaching and when I present work with regard to these growing racial disparities, this slide, because it shows that most millennials have some post-secondary experience, right? So we tend to think of or hone in on these average numbers about 35% of our population has a college degree, but those numbers tend to hide or mask the many individuals who have either started and stopped or are working towards completing their degree and fall into that some college category. And as you can see, across or independent of race and ethnicity, this tends to be the largest category, and particularly among millennial young adults. Why this is important is, yes, a growing share of our population is interacting with the higher education field in the sector, but we can't ignore how they are funding their education, and a lot of them have debt. So as I referenced earlier, we want to be aware that there's a growing subpopulation within our sample, or within our population of individuals who may have debt and no college degree. Next slide, please. So when Jason, my co-author, and I began this work, relatively few studies explored the disproportionate role of student debt among Black students. Now, this has changed, thankfully. In June of 2018, a letter was sent to the current Secretary of Education by several U.S. senators to raise attention to the ways in which the federal student loan program was disproportionately impacting students of color. And then that was followed up in early 2019 in which 4 senators put out a call for stakeholder input on how to address racial disparities in student loan debt. Next slide. Last September, I was asked to contribute to a Washington Post article, and subsequently also became an online article to address the student debt burden that was faced by Black borrowers. And they asked us to provide what one solution could you provide. But given the work that I have done and others have done in this space highlights disparities in both the accumulation and repayment phases of the process, we argued that there was no one solution, but that efforts to address racial wealth inequality in particular was important for such substantive long-term generational change. So that's my last slide as far as kind of summarizing the landscape of what has been going on, in particular with a focus on young adults and the racial disparities in student loan debt in particular. And as I said, my focus has been predominantly on Black borrowers in this space, and really trying to highlight how the growing necessity and need of acquiring credentials in the form of educational attainment is tied to debt accumulation and the inability to both have the same returns in the labor market, but also acquire wealth, and that this may be contributing to ongoing and reproducing racial wealth inequality. So I'll stop there, and I don't know if I have any time for questions. If not, then I will pass it over to Catherine. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Fenaba. And we have just a couple minutes, and I have just. So I'm gonna just throw 1 or 2 questions at you that you can answer in the time that we have. But this goes to the question around kind of the ramifications or the longer term issues that your study kind of causes for this population. So I'm thinking about things that maybe you kind of alluded to but didn't name outright necessarily, but for instance, purchasing a home later on down the line, or starting a business, or the capacity to save for retirement, or even just perhaps emergency savings. So do you have any evidence, or do you know of any studies that kind of show how this is impacting those longer term, goals and life, events that people kind of strive for?
Yeah, so there actually has been a lot of research, I would say, on, an increasing and a growing research body of research that is exploring the short and long-term effects of student loan debt. I will say, because I've done a lot of work in this over the last few years, that unfortunately, not many of those studies do a racialized analysis to say if there are differences. So we need some more. Well, then there needs to be some more work there. But I will say that I think, so there's a lot of work that has looked at, like just the similar outcomes that you just named, how home ownership, saving for retirement, even like financial issues later on, so the ability to pay your bills, and so very important, with regard to having emergency savings. And I think that what we are seeing, and what I tried to allude to or try to highlight earlier, is that if we know that Black borrowers are having difficulty in the repayment period, defaulting or delinquency, that not only makes has a negative effect on one's credit report, but makes borrowing and the ability to acquire assets more expensive, and makes it harder to borrow, and makes acquiring assets more expensive later. So these all, directly have direct and short-term negative outcomes, but also in the long term may have serious implications for the ability to accumulate wealth over time. So, but we need some more work to actually to highlight. We know it's like one of those things that we feel like we know what's going on, but the data is just we're working with the data that we have in order to highlight what we can see. So we're getting there. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Fenaba. Really appreciate it. And we're going to go ahead and move along to Kat. And I'm going to move this slide. If you can stick around, Fenaba, if questions pop up later, that's great. But I do know that you're busy, so if you have to hop off the line, that's fine. And if questions do come for you later in the presentation, I can always forward those to you. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kat Welbeck.
Hi, this is Kat. I just want to start by thanking Laura, Hallie, the Center for Financial Security, the Wisconsin Coalition on Student Debt, and the Urban League of Greater Madison for the opportunity to present today during today's webinar. And then I just also really want to add that it's just like such an honor to present with Fenaba, and I'm really excited to talk a little bit more about advocacy and policy recommendations to address some of the racial disparities that she spoke to in the student debt crisis. So with that, I'll just get started on the next slide. I thought it might be helpful just to start with a bit of an introduction to me and our organization, the Student Borrower Protection Center. So again, my name is Kat Welbeck, and I'm the Civil Rights Counsel at the Student Borrower Protection Center. And as you can see here, we're a national nonprofit organization that's solely focused on how do we alleviate the burden of the student debt crisis for the 45 million people in this country who are getting a student loan bill each and every month. So what we do with our work, we engage in a mix of advocacy, policymaking, and litigation strategy to rein in industry abuses, protect borrowers' rights, and also advance economic opportunity for the next generation of students. And so the SBPC, we're working on a nationwide effort to end the student debt crisis by empowering policymakers and advocates to take action to address many of the disparities that we're talking about today. And so with that, on the next slide, as we just heard in Fenaba's presentation, there's really mounting evidence that shows that the rippling effects of the student debt crisis are substantial. And, I think as a country, we're really just beginning to see more broadly and really talk about how much this debt fuels economic, gender, and racial inequity. And really, like Fenaba was touching upon, inhibits asset accumulation, accelerates the racial wealth gap, and is really carving out a generational divide. So more specifically in my role as Civil Rights Counsel at SBPC is to primarily focus on examining the student debt crisis through a lens of racial and economic justice. So we officially launched our project in January of this year to really focus on how civil rights, fair lending, and consumer protection laws really need to be used to address racial discrimination and broader inequity in the student debt crisis. And so, as we heard, there are really some vast racial disparities in borrower outcomes. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly talk about one of our recent reports that took an in-depth look at those disparities in 4 cities, talk about a little bit how that rings true here in Wisconsin, and then talk about some of the policy and advocacy recommendations to address these vast gaps in borrower outcomes. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about our Disparate Debt report. And so in June of this year, we released a report, Disparate Debt, that examined data from 4 U.S. cities, so Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, San Francisco, and New York City. So each of these cities were chosen because they recently worked with their regional Federal Reserve banks to produce reports analyzing student debt trends within their community. So what we did, we then analyzed that data produced through this effort to identify trends and insights across the cities related to the impact of student debt on communities of color. The report also draws upon Fenaba's research in addition to other economists to reinforce the evidence of the role of student debt in exacerbating the cycle of inequality and the persistent racial wealth gap in this country. So one major thing that we do in this report, you just show the more racially segregated a neighborhood grows, the larger the student loan disparities become. So with borrowers in the most, so what we saw is borrowers in the most segregated areas were up to 5 times more likely to fall behind on their loans than those in the widest communities. So what I'll briefly do is go through a few of the high-level findings in some of these cities. So one of the main things that we saw, and this is something that Pinabit discussed, is that Black and Latinx majority areas are seeing some of the fastest growing student loan debt. And so across these cities, we saw that Black and Latinx borrowers take on greater debt burdens to finance their higher education, and with many of the largest and fastest growing student loan balances in Black in majority Black communities. So, for example, in Washington, D.C., 6 of the 8 neighborhoods where student debt is growing the fastest are majority or predominantly communities of color. And then over the last decade, the average student loan debt balances in D.C. increased in several majority Black neighborhoods by as much as 217%, while median debt balances decreased by 30% in some of the widest neighborhoods. And so we saw that similarly in San Francisco, where the ratio of student loan debt to income is almost twice as high in communities of colors in comparison to majority white neighborhoods. And then you see something similar also in New York City on this chart. And so you see the more complete circles where there are a larger proportion of where communities where there are larger proportions of in communities of color, you see that there's a higher reliance on debt. And so what we really see is this trend playing out across each of these cities. And so on the next slide, we see that, again, we're seeing that communities of color also have a higher debt burdens in relation to income. So similarly, one of our charts showing one example of Philadelphia neighborhoods where the debt to income ratio increases significantly, where communities are predominantly Black and Latinx communities in comparison to predominantly white communities. And so just a couple of more findings. We also, in addition to higher debt burdens, again, we saw that delinquency rates also disproportionately spike in neighborhoods with high Black and Latinx communities. So borrowers in different areas of like the same city are facing hugely different levels of distress in their loans. And so as we saw, that these disparities really closely track with the racial makeup of the neighborhoods where the borrowers are. So again, another example, in one of the cities that we examined in San Francisco, the rate of student loan delinquency is over 7.5 times higher in areas with the largest proportion of communities of color versus like the widest areas. So more generally, what we found is that across these cities, a borrower in a majority minority neighborhood is 2.6 times more likely to fall behind on their student loans than a borrower in a majority white neighborhood. And then even further than that, a borrower in a community that is 90% non-white is 5 times more likely to fall behind on their student loans than borrowers in the whitest community. So we're just seeing like just really, really vast disparities in borrowers' abilities in borrowers' student loan distress. And then also, again, similarly with student loan delinquency, we saw that student loan default, and so default is when a student loan borrower is 270 days or more behind on their student loans, and default comes with some pretty severe economic consequences. So in addition to negative credit reporting, it could come with federal benefit offsets. So like, for example, Social Security benefits can be offset. It can come with administrative wage garnishment, but there are a lot of negative economic consequences that fall with default. So it's really distressing also to see such high levels of default in these racial disparities in default. So we saw that as the share of Black and Latinx populations increase in any given neighborhood, the incidence of student loan default also climbs. And we saw that across all of the cities. And so On the next slide, I wanted to really talk about, so what does this have to do with Wisconsin? I know we studied these 4 cities, but we studied based on available Federal Reserve data. And so while our report primarily focuses on 4 cities, these disparities are present all across the country. And one thing that I really want to emphasize is the importance of getting more local data and research to better understand the breadth and magnitude of these disparities in specific communities. And so I wanted to show on this slide a map of Milwaukee, so where you can see the connection between how deeply a neighborhood is segregated, where also that connection to the borrower's repayment distress, and really emphasizing that although we may not have data at the granularity that we did for these other cities, we can imagine similar trends, and also just really emphasizing the importance of getting that data to really highlight, how alarming and how widespread these disparities are. And so on the next slide, I just want to continue to draw this connection between neighborhood segregation and student debt. And so another recent report from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in this chart highlighted the significant gaps in debt burdens between, again, majority white, majority minority zip codes, and 10 of the nation's most segregated cities. And as you can see here, non-white communities had higher debt burdens across the board. And I think, Senator really addressed many of the causes previously in her presentation, but just really wanted to take a second here, just again to highlight the higher debt burdens present in communities of color. And then similarly on the next slide, we also see a relationship between neighborhood segregation and default. So much of what we talked about in our disparate debt report for those cities, again, we see here at this level that also plays across other cities across the country. So again, here we're looking at 10 of the nation's most segregated cities, and in both the national and city level data, that we're seeing that default rates in communities of color are significantly higher than the default rates in predominantly white communities. And so again, another call for the importance of this data to see, we see these gaps in some places 2 to 3 times higher in communities of color versus in predominantly white communities. And so on the next slide, so what are we doing about this? So we see that the racial disparities in this crisis are a result of and continue to exacerbate systemic discrimination. So when we think about the student debt crisis, I think we must both think of it as a consumer protection issue and then also a civil rights issue. And so, as we're talking about how do we create a more equitable and just economy, we can't just overlook the long-standing effects of discriminatory economic policy and how our current student debt crisis is a direct reflection of and continues to perpetuate those systemic barriers and racial discrimination. So, when we really talk about addressing racial and economic justice head on, we have to really think about ways to protect student loan borrowers, especially with these racial disparities in mind. And so on the next slide, I just want to talk a little bit about Wisconsin-specific stats, just to echo what Laura mentioned in her introduction. So again, a little over 700,000 Wisconsin borrowers owe a collective $23.9 billion in student loan debt. And the average borrower in the state owes over $33,000, and over 90,000 of the state's borrowers are delinquent on their loans, accounting for $1 billion of outstanding debt. And so one thing I want to do is kind of draw this back to some of the advocacy work that we're doing at the SBPC. So in our States for Borrower Protection project, we provide support to advocates, policymakers, and others working to protect borrowers by providing data to help think about what kind of policy solutions can help level this playing field and help protect borrowers. So we really take a look at some of the way that states and the state governments are stepping up to protect student loan borrowers. So on the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about what some states are doing and what is a borrower bill of rights. And so a borrower bill of rights is a set of affirmative protections for student loan borrowers that we see in nearly every other consumer finance market. So they really do three major things. So really setting a standard for how to handle the student loan market, and then also how to ban abusive practices and creating, private rights of actions for borrowers, and creating, working to enforce any violations of, federal or state law, and then also demanding transparency, just so states have the ability to supervise the student loan market for anything that, might be perpetuating some of these disparities or causing student loan borrowers to struggle more. And one thing that's really unique is that student loan debt has grown exponentially since the Great Recession. And so coming out of the Great Recession, we got really critical protections like the Dodd-Frank Act for many consumer financial products and services. But because student loans really boomed in the last decade, many of these common sense protections that exist for other consumer finance products and services don't necessarily exist in the student loan space. And so borrower bill of rights are really critical for changing that. And so we've seen since 2014, a dozen states have passed legislation to establish a student loan borrower bill of rights, and we're seeing that others are on track to do something similar in 2021 and moving forward. And so on this next slide, I'm just going to try to draw the connection between how does a borrower bill of rights provide critical protections for student loan borrowers, and then even from there, how does that help address some of these racial disparities that we've been talking about in the student loan market. And so I like to think of it, on the next slide. Oh, great, thanks. And so one thing I like to think about when we're thinking about what a state borrower bill of rights does in comparison to us having federal laws on the books. So the federal level, the law permits, for example, if we're talking about racial disparities in the student debt crisis, the law permits examinations for fair lending compliance. And so thinking about it is this way. So and federal law ensures that, all borrowers have access to certain benefits of their loans, but the state laws can also go a step further, ensuring that, that they can really go into the books, really examine the industry and make sure that that's actually happening. And so one thing I'm going to kind of look at is an example of how income-driven repayment is one critical way that we can think about how to improve borrower outcomes, but also the state's role in ensuring that borrowers are protected. So one thing, again, as I mentioned, that a borrower bill of rights creates affirmative protections for borrowers. And one of those things is, for example, student loan servicers are in charge of ensuring that borrowers have the correct information or their repayment plans, know that if they should be enrolled in or could benefit from certain programs like income-driven repayment. And so as you can see here, though, right now in the student loan market, we're seeing that income-driven repayment, which is a really critical protection to providing borrowers with affordable student loan repayment options, is not being accessed or used equally across the board. When we look here, notably, the Urban Institute found in this chart here that borrowers of color are nearly as likely to not be making student loan payments as they are to be making income-driven repayment payments. And so why is this, again, so important? On the next slide, federal law provides a series of borrower protections designed to help mitigate default or financial distress for federal student loans. And for federal student loans, again, this is 92% of the student loan market. So this is the vast majority of student loan borrowers. And so one of the things is generally federal student loan borrowers pretty much have near universal availability of income-driven repayment plans, which makes payments affordable based on borrowers' income. And so generally borrowers should be able to have access to income-driven repayments as long as they submit documentation for eligibility each year through a process called recertification. And so student loan services are responsible for informing borrowers about the availability of IDR and also in enrolling and recertifying borrowers in IDR plans. And so this should really make default rare by decreasing the likelihood of default for borrowers who are able to maintain and stay in the program year to year. And even research has shown that one report found the default rates for borrowers who are not enrolled in IDR 28 times higher than those who are enrolled in IDR. And so what we can see here, as we saw from the chart before, as we talked about, default disparities earlier, you really shouldn't be seeing these broad-based gaps in default if borrowers have access to a program to allow them affordable repayment options. So that's not what we're seeing. Not only are we seeing that borrowers of color are less likely to be enrolled in this program, but we're also seeing, again, borrowers of color having higher rates and incidences of default. And so this is one place where you can imagine if you had more oversight on, what's going on the back end with servicers. Are all borrowers being informed of their ability to access these programs, or just making sure that, borrowers have servicers have an affirmative duty to inform borrowers of their eligibility to enroll and recertify in these income-driven repayment plans. It can really play a really critical role in reducing this incidence of default. And so this is one example. There are many things that a borrower bill of rights can do, but it's just an example of how one broad way that this action can help also have an effect on some of the racial disparities that we're seeing in borrower outcomes. But borrower bill of rights do many things, like before, again, abandoning abusive practices, creating special protections for public service workers and older adults, or even creating, state-level advocates to stand up for borrowers' rights, or really creating more transparency in the market so there is a space to kind of go in and see if when things are going wrong, or we're seeing really broad disparities in borrower outcomes, to really have more space to examine what's going on there. And so with that, I'll go to the next slide, and again, just more benefits of IDR protections. Again, going back to my earlier point, and then the next slide. So I got a little ahead of myself and skipped the slide. But with that, I just really wanted to thank you all again for the opportunity to talk a little bit more about our work and some of the work that we're doing to address the racial disparities in the student debt crisis. But really excited to take any questions.
Very good. Thanks so much, Kat. That was an incredible wealth of information, and really, helped to shine a light on, how this is affecting Black students and Black population that has either graduated or not, but has student loan debt. Question for you, and I believe that this question was actually meant for FENABA. So forgive me if you don't have this information, and I can always pass it on. But do you know what proportion of Black students borrow in Wisconsin, and how much? So kind of, honing in on some of those stats that you were giving, but not sure if that's something you know off the top of your head.
It's not something I know off the top of my head, and my answer, and this is kind of drawing back to something I was saying about the data that we used for our report on disparate debt. So we don't have that specific data, but one thing that Fed data did is looking at the racial looking at the racial composition of neighborhoods, and then using that, and then also using credit panel data to look at looking at student debt, so student loan balances, rates of delinquency and default, and then it kind of merged. So it looked at, so at the zip code level data, for example, in Philadelphia, they were able to draw upon a neighborhood, a zip code racial composition, but then also draw upon the credit panel data for that zip code and be able to draw those comparisons. So while we don't have that data for Wisconsin, that's again another call for the importance of being able to get this data if there's a way to do these reports in other cities to kind of have an idea or a clearer picture of what's really going on at the community level, because I think that was one thing we found even in doing the report. We knew these disparities were there. We knew they were at the national level, and then even looking at the New York Fed report of the 10 most segregated cities, we knew they were there. But really being able to see at the granular level, granular level at the community level, it really just even painted a more stark picture. So I know that's kind of a roundabout way to answer your question, to say no, but again, really just a call for being able to get more of that data.
And then another question that I was going to ask. So you talked a lot about the income-based repayment and how that's not taken up at the same rates with Black student loan borrowers. And so I'm wondering, are there other programs that you've found that just are kind of flying under the radar for this population? I don't know, any kind of forgiveness programs that just aren't being taken up as much by Black student loan borrowers, especially given the hurdles that forgiveness programs have in place, or grace periods, or other types of really helpful programs.
That's a really great question. And while our work, we primarily looked into research focusing on income-driven repayment, and maybe this is something I can send you after, but I know our colleagues have done some really great work, and it's, again, not necessarily race-based, but also just, really great work talking again about, public service loan forgiveness, and also just talking about some issues with wage garnishments. I can share some of our other colleagues' work, but I don't have other data outside of that.
Fair enough. That would be asking a lot for you to kind of pull that out of your hat right now. But thanks so much, Kat. And I'm going to go ahead and move into the next portion of the webinar. And if you have time to stick on the line and weigh in kind of at the end of the webinar for the Q&A following the panel, I invite you to do that, but also understand time constraints. So with that, we're going to go ahead and move into the panel discussion. And so I do invite our panelists to go ahead and turn on their webcams. This will be more of a, hopefully, a interactive type format. Oh, fantastic. I see all three faces. And so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, which seems to have worked so that nothing is kind of taking up any more of the space than needs to for these fine folks. So very good. And with that, I would love to extend an invitation to go ahead and have our three panelists give a kind of brief introduction of yourself, and please then, tell where you're speaking from, what your role is, and then how you interact with student loan borrowers. And I'm going to go ahead and just kind of invite in the order that I can see you on my screen, which is Jocelyn, then Kiamani, and then Langston.
I was like, oh, please don't let it be me first. My name is Jocelyn Diaz-Valdez. I work for the Office of Student Financial Aid. I serve as one of the advisors on a team of about 10 of us, where we help students and families navigate the sometimes very complicated financial aid process. And that can begin as early as high school, and sometimes even sooner, where we're speaking to families all the way up until the time they complete their degrees. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question?
just introducing yourself. So a little bit of your background, but you've kind of just already given a brief overview. And so next up, if that's all.
Okay, thank you.
All right, good afternoon now to everyone. My name is Kimani Alford. I serve as the Dean of Student Access and Success at Madison Area College, Technical College, where I have been there approximately about 3 years and 8 months. However, I've been in higher education approximately about 21 years. I've started my journey specifically in the 4-year public institution in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I was there at UW Milwaukee for about 14 years. So I've saw, as far as financial aid from a student perspective, also a professional perspective. I've also been in the student loan industry where I was there for about 3.5 years. So I saw it also from a perspective of actually collecting loans and training other financial aid professionals. And now, of course, in the 2-year technical sector, where I also get to work with students as well and understand as far as the many challenges that they face regarding access into higher education, but specifically having those personal one-on-one conversations with students about student loan debt as well. So thank you for having me.
Good afternoon, all. I'm happy to be here. My name is Langston Evans, and I'm happy to be representing the Madison Metropolitan School District, where I am the AVID District Coordinator. I've been in this particular role for the last 5 years and working with students in both the public education sector and nonprofit sector for about the last 20 years. And within my role, one of my key responsibilities is working with all of our educators in our secondary system, grades 6 through 12, on helping students become ready for a college, career, and community, and what they're going to do next after high school. And figuring out how they're going to pay for some of their endeavors after high school has been one of the critical key conversations that we've been having across our system for the last few years. And part of what my specific role also is to provide additional opportunities and experiences for our students who have been marginalized, particularly our students of color and our students who come from families with limited economic resources. And those conversations take on a different tenor, but that is really the work, providing support and services for all, but really finding ways to be creative to support those students who have been marginalized, have been left underrepresented in many of our institutions of higher learning, and really finding ways to make sure that they're successful with their own goals and dreams.
Very good. Thank you all. I'm so glad that you're all here. And you come from a variety of different backgrounds and serving students, you know, in different places in their path towards higher education, and then perhaps taking on student loan debt. So I'm going to start with a question that I'll throw out to all of you, but I know that as I kind of go through some of these questions that we have prepared, there are perhaps questions that maybe might not be quite as relevant to you, so feel free to pass. But I would love to hear from all of you on all of the questions if it pertains. So first off, and this is queued up very nicely kind of after Kat Welbeck spoke, because she talked about the repayment plans and how those are not taken up quite as often by Black students or Black student loan borrowers who are repaying, and so it's a missed opportunity. And so this question is really around what are some of the misperceptions or perhaps lack of information about student loans that you see among the students that you serve? And so I'll just start with Jocelyn again.
So I see so many misperceptions regarding student loans. I think the spectrum is wide. I think at the one end of the spectrum, you have many students who are just petrified of student loans, who will avoid them like the plague because they've heard so many horror stories. And one particular student comes to mind that I met with last summer, just was scared, had never taken out a student loan, but she was struggling to pay rent, However, even though she was being offered a very good loan, a loan that was an institutional loan, so it wasn't a federal loan. There was no interest on this student loan. It could have helped her with her expenses. She was actually putting her rent on a credit card. And we kind of talk through that so that you have from students who are so scared of student loans that they're going into just other types of consumer debt, which are going to probably be more adverse and just have different types of risks, to students who I spoke with a family this week who was just kind of borrowing $50,000 for the upcoming school year. And we talked about what that would mean if they did that for the next 4 years and how I advised against it. So you see the spectrum, from folks who are trying to avoid student loans to folks who are just like, I have no other option. I have to take out these student loans, and just not seeing a middle path. I think that's one of the things I try to do when speaking with students and families, is helping them understand what is a middle path, what's a reasonable amount of student loan debt, and even thinking about, which can be a very hard conversation when you're 17, 18, 19, what is 40,000 in student loan debt? What is, for this one family that was borrowing 50,000 in 1 year, what is that gonna, what is 200,000 at the end of this 4 years of college gonna mean? What is repayment gonna look like? So kind of having all of those conversations, and helping both students and families come up with reasonable solutions and reasonable amount of student loan debt if necessary.
Yeah, I think to add on to what Jocelyn shared, I mean, I definitely believe that students now, they are becoming a little bit more aware of student loan debt and as far as the impact that it can have. I can even recall having a conversation with my godson who just recently graduated from Madison East High School here in Madison, and just discussing college and trying to identify what's his next path or what do you want to do. And the first thing that came out of his mouth was, I think I want to wait to go to college because I want to save up enough money so I can pay for it because I don't want to take out any loans. And of course, that goes into the whole aspect of financial literacy and having conversations with him to allow him to understand as far as truly what student loans are, the purpose of them, and then also educating him to understand or tell any student, just because you're offered a certain amount, it does not mean that you have to take the full amount. And I think that has been some of, as far as the lack of information, where students feel that if a student loan is offered to you, especially when it comes to students of color, that if it's offered to you that you have to take the full amount of the loan. It's truly provided there for students to use if they need it. And I think those are some of the conversations that have to happen, some of the conversations that do happen in a sense where it provides that clarity. But we have a lot of students in the sense that are given this luxurious financial aid package in some cases, or in some cases don't even have enough funding in the sense to cover all of their cost of attendance. And they lean on student loans, not truly understanding the whole impact of it, not understanding the difference between a subsidized and an unsubsidized loan, not understanding that technically you don't pay back the principal of the loan until 6 months after you graduate, not understanding that even when you graduate, if you get into a financial hardship, there are protections that allows a student, in a sense, to do a forbearance or to do the income-driven repayment plan that prevents them from going into default, which also alludes into as far as those negative consequences, because I end up finding out and having conversations. I've had multiple conversations where students have went into default, and I have a conversation like, well, did you answer the call from the servicer? No. Why didn't you answer the call from the servicer? Because I knew that I didn't have enough money, in a sense, to pay them. Well, why didn't you, in a sense, have those conversations to say, hey, this is my situation. What are those options? So I often have, in a sense, had those experiences and those conversations, those tough conversations with students, in a sense where I have taken the big brother approach to say, hey, there's options. Don't avoid this. Have the conversations, because this is what's, in a sense, going to get you over the hump and allow you, in a sense, not to be negatively impacted by garnishments, by your credit being impacted. There was conversations early in the presentations about students delaying making big purchases, such as a home or saving for a retirement because of student loan debt. But I think the misconception is that a lot of students, especially when they're required to do interest loan counseling, they're doing the process, but they're not understanding the process. when it comes into understanding student loan information and borrowing. So it often accounts for some form of hardship, but of course, having those conversations and being able to have those conversations with students, and those students is coming in seeking information versus, in a sense, not truly understanding what it really takes to borrow a student loan, is some of those misperceptions and, of course, lacking of information that's within higher ed.
Yes, I completely concur with what has previously been said. And as I'm working with students at a different stage, we think about the ideas that student loans for many will be or college, and then the loans that might be one option to pay for college. College itself is for many people going to be the most expensive purchase they make outside of their home. And thinking about the beliefs and perceptions that undergird those choices and understandings of what that whole process is, not just for students, but for their families, is not something that can happen over a conference or a fact sheet or a module. And so we know that the marginalization of students and the systemic oppression that particularly affects our Black and Brown students impacts the way they see the world, impacts the experiences that they have had historically with opportunities around financing, around money, around the conversations that happen in those areas and on those topics. And so knowing the emotionally charged kinds of discussions that we want to have with students, which we're preparing our students to have those conversations all throughout their educative experience in our K-12 systems. But in those conversations, we definitely see that there are perceptions. And I don't know that I would call them misperceptions, but I will call them perceptions that our society has allowed certain groups of people to have. They've allowed certain groups of people not to have the information and resources for them to feel empowered with money, among other things. And so I do concur that there's definitely students who are, and families who are averse to the notion of loans for a variety of reasons, some of them good, but often that prevents them from understanding more deeply what's going on. We do have conversations with families and students who don't wish to investigate further once they get offered money. And so the notion that you are a consumer and you have rights and you're making an extraordinary purchase, and that you can continue to assert and empower yourself throughout that process. It's not a one-stop shop. You sign this and it's done. It is an ongoing process, is another notion. And that the folks that are like Kimani and Jocelyn, that are there to work with you throughout this process. This is not, I decided to do this, I'm going to work myself out of this. And so we see that as a perception, that this is not simply a purchase that's done. And certainly the notion of what are the long-term impacts? What are the midterm impacts and what are the immediate impacts? Students, as Jocelyn pointed out, to determining that they're not going to get a food plan because they are going to not take out a loan for that. And then they enter into situations where they are endangering themselves physically and not allowing themselves to do as well as they possibly could in school. And the last one I'll just sort of lift up here is the underappreciation of the relationship between academics and preparedness and the financial implications of whatever loans you take out. All down the line, your preparedness and your preparedness both academically and how you're going to transition to your new life, wherever you go, wherever you live, however you study. Those pieces are critical, not just in high school, but also as you enter into your post-secondary institution and as you matriculate through that. Understanding those pieces are absolutely connected to each other is a misperception and misunderstanding that isn't always able to be addressed in the way we address our students.
Oh, excellent answers. And you've really actually answered the kind of second part of that question, which had to do with some What are some unintended consequences that may, kind of occur because of these misperceptions, or as Langston put it so well, these perceptions that are actually based on some real things. But if you have anything else to add, Jocelyn, do you have anything that you've seen kind of occur because of the decisions that students have made, unintended consequences, I suppose?
You definitely see unintended consequences occur because of students' decisions. One of the things that I try my hardest in working with students, and I help oversee some of our program that's geared to serve students that have historically been underrepresented on our campus, or as one of my colleagues likes to call it, communities that have historically been exploited. So what I see is sometimes a sense of I don't have options, kind of like what Langston was saying. It's just like, this is what I have, and I can't do anything about it. So one of my things in working with students is just making them understand, or helping them come to the realization that no matter what their situation is, they always have options. As far as maybe I don't need to borrow that loan, or as Kimani was saying, I don't need the full loan. Or for some students, and I've worked with students who've taken some time away, whether it be to establish residency because of the different costs that it would cost to attend the state institution, being a resident versus a non-Wisconsin resident. So there's always different, as far as what are my options, what will come down the line. There will be consequences. So making sure students understand everything that they have in front of them.
Mm-hmm. Kimani and Langston, do you have anything else to add in terms of the consequences of these decisions, or taking up or loans or not?
I would say just one specific thing. One of the unintended consequences is really the student getting to the end of the finish line and realizing that they borrowed more loan money than since they expected. But at Madison College, what we did was we decided to really look at this as far as from a financial wellness, financial literacy lens, to truly try to understand our students and what they were borrowing as far as when it came to loans. We ended up finding out that 53% of our students that had basically completed the survey, a little bit over 12,000 students that had completed it, but 53% of those students indicated to us that they believe that they borrowed more money in student loans than they actually had to. So that kind of helps to speak to as far as the mindset of our students as they're coming into higher education and really trying to find ways to educate them. Of course, it all roots back, in my opinion, as far as the financial education, financial literacy aspect of it, as far as what do they know when they're entering college? What are those resources that they're provided as they're in high school or grade school, coming into the whole college sector, truly to understand what those options are, as Jocelyn was saying, in order when it comes into their finances. Are they really well diverse in the whole budgeting aspect of it? And really crunching the numbers to see what do I truly need in order to afford my education. So, I think that kind of alludes to some of that whole aspect of as far as those unintended consequences.
Yeah, I would just jump in and say that there's two which I would just want to lift up. One is when our students are making those really important and stressful decisions about where they will go after high school, college mismatch based on the notion that they're choosing college but on the perception that they don't want to take out any loans, which eliminates really good options for some of our students and options that would allow them to thrive and grow and become professionals that could contribute to their families and our society. And they're making these decisions because of misinformation and the perceptions that we've allowed those students to have. The second is, and this is more specific to a particular group of students, but I think I see unintended consequence with some of our staff that we've been working on, and some parents, is a disinclination to explore historically Black colleges and universities for some of our students, because they see them as out of state or private and needing to take loans and wanting to do loan have options without loans. And it puts students in a place where they may not feel like they're going to thrive, and then they do not complete their degree, whereas in a place where they were taking loans in an appropriate and thoughtful and intentional way would provide them an experience that they would absolutely thrive in, that they would complete and then be able to contribute. And not only in an economic way, but in a way that is meaningful for them, their families, and our society. So I think those two unintended consequences of sort of loan aversion or fear in many ways perpetuates the systemic oppression of our students of color who are not reaching where they could go, are not attaining what they could, and not then contributing back and growing their families and their communities in the ways that are possible.
Thank you. I'm glad that we asked that second part of the question. That was some really good insights. So now moving to another kind of approach to this, and just being quite blunt about what you're seeing. What are some of the differences that you've noticed in how white students versus students of color approach student loan borrowing? And I'll throw that first one to Kimani, and then to Langston, and then back to Jocelyn, just to kind of mix it up, the order a bit.
Yeah, what I've noticed overall in my tenure is the treatment of money. When it comes into students of color and analyzing as far as the whole white student, when it came into that, it's really as far as when it specifically have that student sitting in your office and truly trying to understand as far as what their needs are, understanding as far as what their family structure is in some cases, and also what their responsibilities are. The value or the look of money is different when it comes into looking at financial aid or student loans. I've had many students in my office and having conversations where, in some cases, especially students of color, where student loans wasn't necessarily just providing an opportunity for education. It was also providing an opportunity to support their family. And that was one of the driving forces in the sense where it came into, I now have access to these dollars in order to help support the downfall of as far as having enough finances in order to truly do what's necessary for students. So I think we've always had, or those that's in higher education have experienced it ourselves, where we went to college and you get a refund check or excess cash check, and you wonder, what do I truly do with it? Do I go shopping? Or in a sense, do I say, I don't really need this money? It's few and far in between where you have that student saying, you know what, I have this loan that I've taken out. I truly don't need it, so I want to give it back. But you always have, in some cases, that student says, well, now I have access to these dollars. Let me go ahead and use them for some other means that might be a benefit. I've had situations where parents, in a sense, are not involved in that conversation heavily as far as when it comes to the student of color versus, in a sense, the white student, where you're not getting all of those unanswered questions behind the scenes in the consultation or advising experience. So the student of color, in a sense, without the absence of that parent or that guardian there, often borrows money. I mean, I was a first generation student myself. I was raised by my aunt. My aunt never stepped foot on the college campus. The whole 4.5 years of me being on the college campus, she never stepped foot, never had a conversation about financial aid with the financial counselor. It was all me, in a sense, making those decisions. And as a result of it, I even borrowed more money than I needed to. But it's just those type of situations when it comes into the whole financial literacy aspect of it, where the student of color isn't privy to it, where in a sense, in some cases, the white student is, and they have the access to that. And based off of it, it makes different decisions or different lanes or streets, and since we go down when it comes into the whole student loan debt aspect of it.
Yes, completely concur with that. I'll take it from this perspective. First, I think it's an interesting question. I want to acknowledge and recognize that there is variation within the groups that we talk about. And so with our district, we have 27,000 students, the second largest district in Wisconsin, and our district is 58% students of color. And our teaching staff is over 80% white. And so I'm going to talk about the experience of the students as having different access to resources and their families having different access to resources. Because the way that they engage, build relationships to talk about these kinds of things takes people who understand that take time to understand and appreciate the histories and traditions of the students for which they are having communication with. And I think not just our teachers, but our institutions of finance and community organizations, how are they getting this information? What I see is that white students have more access to information that's tailored to them, to their families, to their situations. And so they have a network where if they have a question, they know how to get the answer. In many cases, but not all, of course, our students of color, particularly our Black and brown students, are students who are often having one or two options to get information. And then if those options aren't connecting with them in a way that feels right and authentic to them, then they will close out that information, even if it's good information. And so I feel like the experiences of just the availability and the access and the appropriateness of the information our families and students have lead them in very different places with regard to understanding loans. And so, unfortunately, when we're talking to students who are Black and brown, it's starting the conversation of just building trust about having conversations about money versus now let's get into the nitty-gritty about what does return on investment look like when you take out this product versus this product, right? And so it's because of the situation that we find ourselves in as a community, as a society, about who has access, who feels like they are empowered to get access, and how are we tailoring the information around loans and finance to particular groups of people that feels real and authentic to their lives.
So when I thought about this question, the first word that came to mind was safety net. Our white students, in my experience, have seemed to have this safety net that our students of colors don't have access to, which I think aligns with what Langston was saying. I speak to so many of our majority students who I'm speaking to, the parents. Oftentimes, if they are borrowing a loan and it's at the end of their academic careers, the parents are talking about how they will help them repay this loan. I've talked to students who take out loans, even who also have these huge safety nets, who it's like, I'm taking out this loan because my parent wants me to be responsible and kind of put a little bit of this on me, but I have X amount of money, and I'm just like almost in shock, because most of our students of color who are taking out these loans, they're not doing it kind of as preparation to, I'm showing some ownership, putting some skin in the game. It's I'm taking out this loan because it's the only way that I have to pay for both my education, my housing, my food, and also similar to what Kamani said, they're borrowing these loans oftentimes to help families. And they are that main, or not main, but just a huge part of the resources for the family. There is no safety net. There is no other option for so many of our students of color, is what I've seen as far as some of the big differences in borrowing.
Thank you all for those thoughtful answers. That was incredibly helpful, I think, in all of us thinking about this issue. So based on your experiences, what more can be done for borrowers of color to minimize unmanageable debt before, during, and after college? And I know that you all have already touched on this a bit, but maybe if you can delve into that a little bit more, perhaps speak to someone has already entered a question asking about solutions or information or availability of information that is both readily accessible but also appropriate and relevant to the students that you serve. So I'm going to start with Langston this time and then go to Jocelyn and then Kimani.
For me, it is really working together with public education, institutions of higher education, and community organizations to identify more opportunities to have conversations with communities about student loans. We know that most of our students in high school aspire to go to college. Not all, but most. From our surveys and from national surveys, that's what students are telling us. We aren't equipping them with the environment that provides them with an opportunity to get as much information as possible. We can't do this alone. And so it's working with our colleges and universities, our 2-year, 4-year, our apprenticeships and certificate programs, working with community-based organizations that have connections and communication with our students who have opportunities to get more conversation about these issues. I think that needs to be a collaborative plan in each community to move forward with really making sure that we don't leave families and students out of the loop of information.
So I have 2 thoughts. I think definitely I agree with everything Langston said. It starts with partnership, communication, education. I'm thinking particularly some of the partnerships that we do at UW-Madison with some of our elementary school, where we're talking to parents for some of our Spanish-speaking families. We're talking to them in Spanish. We're talking about the cost of college, savings. We're talking about different institutions and what that would mean as far as return on investment. And also then we're partnering with folks in AVID and in our local high schools where we're talking about financial aid. We're helping them complete FAFSA. So I think all of these things are important. We're creating trust relationships with students that they know they have access to us, and making sure that we are available in the different languages for folks who have questions. But I think the as far as like the solution, I think that's helping it, but I think the solution is we need, free higher ed education, I would say, and we also need to tackle the high cost of college. Because we can talk about debt all we want, and we can talk about how to help students minimize the debt or understand their debt. But if education, which I think we all agree on this panel, is still the #1 mobilizer for folks to create wealth, to gain wealth, then we have to have free access for communities that have been historically not had access to institutions of higher ed.
Yeah, and I agree with all of those points from both Langston and Jocelyn. A couple things that came to my mind initially when asked the question. One is to educate the entire family or the whole family. I think a lot of times we create programs, we create educational models and tools as our students come into college, and it's geared specifically for the student. We know that right now in higher education, any student that has to take or desires to take out a student loan has to go through interest loan counseling. But we also know that when there's the presence of the family that's understanding the principles when it comes into borrowing loans, student loan debt, finances, that it basically allows an extra layer of support and reinforcement that helps to escape some of the pitfalls of debt. So going the route of partnering with community organizations, partnering with institutions, partnering with schools and other agencies in the sense that can truly focus on educating the entire family, not piece by piece, but the family together, so that when they go home, they can have those conversations of, well, they just shared this information about student loan debt. They share this information about borrowing student loans, these interest rates that change every year when you go into repayment. Have those conversations at the dinner table, sitting around playing a game, or just having those conversations overall in the car. Being able to educate that whole family is truly what's going to make the true impact when it comes to student debt. The other thing is, I think also when you're considering students that go into default. There's research out there that indicates that students with high debt aren't the ones that are most prone to going into default. It's the students with the low debt, because they come into college, they're not academically prepared, and then in a sense they find themselves having a bad fall semester or a bad second semester and say, you know what, college isn't for me, I have this debt, and then they forget about the interest loan counseling that they took before, and then all of a sudden they don't have the financial security in order to make those payments because they don't know that there's options and since that's available for them. So what I say all that to say this: when entering the high school or from high school into college, their first semester they should be required to do some kind of college success course that financial literacy or financial wellness principles are embedded into that particular course to give them an understanding of what it truly takes to get a higher education degree or to pursue your program, because ultimately that's what's going to help. And sometimes students that are in high school, yes, it's great to educate them in high school, and some of that information is going to hold on to them within high school. But I also think, of course, financial literacy and financial education has to start earlier. Those conversations, and I think there's research out there that says financial education should start at the age of 5 and then progress up. And that's where you have, depending on as far as the family structure, the race, ethnicity, where those principles are being infused into the children at those early ages, and those principles are being taught during those early ages. So even as we think about being in the whole higher education sector overall, I think it is really, really important that financial literacy is embedded at each level. Now, especially when you get into, of course, high school, because you have those students that's now thinking about what's going to be my next move. Professionally, what's going to be my next move personally? What do I want to do? And is higher education, in a sense, that option? Of course, we probably can have a debate on this, but we do know that higher education is not for everyone. But for those that pursue a higher education, then instead of having those principles that's embedded within financial literacy within the high school, and then also as they enter into college, to remind them of, as far as the true nuts and bolts of what it's going to really take in order to take on this loan, if you decide to go that route, and what are those alternative or those other resources that's available to you in order to not take out a student loan. Because that's some of the things, in a sense, that students don't know, that you can possibly even get federal work study and work, in a sense, to pay for your education versus having to take out that loan. And there's also benefits to that whole aspect of it. So I just think as far as those two things will help turn as far as the direction of student loan debt by everyone coming together at the same table and collaborating together to make that impact, both in the post-secondary and the secondary sectors, in order to truly influence student loan debt.
Very good. That's great strategies that you all provided, and that actually goes very nicely into my kind of final question that I'm going to ask before I move into a few questions that have been coming in from the audience. And I'm going to start with you, Jocelyn, and I would ask you also to remind us of your position and organization. Some folks had mentioned they missed that. And then also I wanted to say, Langston, if you, when we reach you for this question, if you could maybe even just tell what AVID is. I think that maybe a few people are not sure what that program is. So the question really is just, and you've already said a few of these as you've been talking, but for this particular question, if you do have some resources that you would recommend to borrowers or to those who work with them in the community or in school, if you could just name some of those or let us know about some of those that have worked really well in your interaction with students and parents, et cetera. And then like I said, I'm happy to kind of make those available, and I'll be recording them as you talk too. Jocelyn, please feel free to go ahead, and then we'll just work on down the line, Kimani to Langston.
Yeah, so Jocelyn Diaz-Valdez again, from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I serve as one of the financial aid advisors. As far as tools, resources, I kept thinking like through the years, there's definitely different tools that we've recommended to students, but I can't think of one tool that has been like the magic, like this is it, like once students get on this tool, everything has been wonderful. It honestly has just been relationship building with our students, sitting down with families, sitting down with students, helping them sometimes on a semester basis, walking through budgets, helping them understand, and then connecting them with perhaps other folks in the community that can help in other aspects as far as their finances and different things in that respect. And what I would recommend to families is to not hesitate to reach out to us. I've worked with students coming to UW-Madison, but I've also worked with students going to HBCUs or going to community colleges or going to private colleges. So we will not, just because if you're not coming to UW, that's okay. We'd be happy to sit down with you. We'd be happy to talk to you. We'd be happy to look at different financial aid offers, which can be confusing, which you might not be able to understand. Okay, what is it that I have to pay out of pocket? Do I have to take this loan? If I do take these loans, some loan offers will automatically add a Parent Plus loan. Does this mean I have to take it? So kind of all of those questions, navigating that, which can for each student and each student situation can be very different. We'd be happy to talk to students. We'd be happy to sit down with entire families and walk them through that process and be with them throughout their academic journeys.
Okay, Kimani Alford, Dean of Student Access and Success at Madison College, which encompasses like financial aid, advising, veterans benefits, a promise program, along with our retention initiatives and student engagement programs at the college, is under that particular area. So as far as some tools, I would say the number one tool that you could probably recommend to any student is to develop a personal relationship with the financial aid administrator. Being able to have that connection, I think, is the number one reinforcement for anyone that's within higher education and the students, since that might have some of those questions. That personal relationship specifically, which makes sure that they know your name, or the student knows that their name, is definitely one I've seen in a sense to be truly, truly positive. Outside of that, as Jocelyn was saying, there's really no true number one tool that we probably can recommend that's out there, because each institution will do various things. Like for example, at our college, we actually built a tool to help students with budgeting and truly understanding the whole impact of their earning potential, and then their student loan debt, and also truly understanding if they have a surplus or overage when it comes into as far as their expenses. But I think one good resource or tool, in the sense to give a student is, or a parent or anyone actually in the community, is tapping into the studentaid.gov website, which really gives you a comprehensive overview of everything financial aid related. So it understands or breaks down as far as the various terms, the different types of aid that's available out there. It taps into or provides information for repayment calculators, which I think often is a wake up process, in a sense, for a student to go through all of their student loans and find out truly what they could be paying if they were to go into repayment. So utilizing that tool as well. And of course, just for students to understand that they can reach out and have those particular questions. Of course, students, as I talked about before, they go through interest loan counseling. But interest loan counseling is the beginning of their career. So sometimes they don't really understand as far as all the nuts and bolts that's within it. So reinforcing that, one thing that we do encourage students to do is to actually review their loan history by going onto the National Student Loan Database System website, which they all have access to when they complete a FAFSA application. So going through there and reviewing that information on a yearly basis or as frequently as possible is one of the other things, and since we say as a tool that students can have access to.
Yes, and again, my name is Langston Evans, and I am with the Madison Metropolitan School District, and I serve as the AVID District Coordinator. AVID stands for Advancement via Individual Determination, It is a 40-year national college readiness system that was started out in California. There's about 5,000 schools across the country and in the Department of Defense that employ it. It's really, in our district, we work with it in two ways. One, we help support academic and career planning, counseling to prepare all students to be ready for what happens after high school. And then we also have a segment of first-generation college students that we provide extra supports and opportunities to, so that they will be successful in a four-year college environment. So I work with our secondary staff in our middle schools and high schools to implement those two pieces to make sure that all students are ready for what happens after high school, but then that we really identified a group of students who are first in their families, that will be first in their families to go to college, mostly students of color, about 85%, and provide them with extra resources, support, and guidance to make sure that they're successful in a four-year college environment. I would concur with what has been said previously. The best resource are human resources, and know the people to know. But I would also add in just a couple quick ones. One, I would say that I found that there are some really probably good videos on Khan Academy that are talking about college financing. It allows people to self-pace, and sometimes it helps people figure out what questions they need to ask of the people once they meet them. I've also found that UW Help has a lot of resources for people exploring the colleges, the 2-year and 4-year colleges in Wisconsin. And for folks thinking about what the college system looks like, I think FAFSA and FAFSA Forecaster are opportunities for people to play around with numbers, depending on where you are in those conversations, even before your senior year, to think through what kinds of opportunities and what financing might look like for you. But again, I return to the notion that the best resources are the human resources. Wherever you are, start with whoever you know. If you know somebody who's has someone in college, start there. If you know whether it's a K-12 educator or a post-secondary person, connect with those, and particularly connect with the places that you are applying to or the places that you are going to attend.
Thank you all. And now I think we're going to go ahead and move into some audience questions. We have a few coming in, and I do invite people to go ahead and submit those right now as well. The first question that I'm going to ask is actually more of a comment, but it brings up a question that I feel like you can all weigh in on. And this comes from Tina Ahedo, and she specifically wanted to thank you, Jocelyn, for talking about the trust issue. And she said that from her experience, parents of color are reluctant to engage in the federal government or the FAFSA process. And she also was saying that the cost of college is definitely an issue. And it's the cost of tuition, obviously, but it's also the cost of, and she stresses the word belonging, and belonging in college. And so this is the cost of doing all those things that help a student to engage in the activities, building that sense of belonging, and therefore that sense of completion, feeling a part of that community that they're learning with. Can be expensive, right? It's expensive to pay for tuition, but it's expensive to also just participate. So what would you all say, and I'll start with you, Jocelyn, what would you say about how you engage students on that topic? And I think that, Kimani, you already talked about the importance of financial literacy and education and money management, but this is a complex issue that I think can be very difficult to probably, talk through with individuals and their families.
So when I heard the word sense of belonging, it kind of tugged at my heart because it immediately brought to mind one student that I was working with, a student of color, who had gotten a substantial amount of financial aid but then found herself in my office pretty early on in the semester because she did not have enough funds to cover her immediate needs. I was blown away, like, what do you mean you don't have money to cover your needs? Like you got this financial aid package. And then as we kept talking and the conversation progressed, I learned that her roommate wasn't on any type of financial aid. She had tons of money. She was always going to the mall and she was always eating out. And the student didn't want to feel left out. She wanted so it just, when I heard that, it tugged at my heart, because so many of our students are looking for that belonging, and the price of belonging can be so costly for some of our students. Something that I encourage students from even before them coming to campus is making sure they find their communities. Making sure, one of the things that we've worked on is helping build some of those communities, from sessions before students arrive to campus through the time that they're on campus, where we're helping students build community, particularly first generation, low income college students, and having a place where you don't have, there's no expectation, there's no cost of belonging. Like, you're welcome just as you are. There isn't, an entrance fee. There isn't, all of these other expectations that come along. And we also do our best to try to connect students with other campus groups. I think of TRIO on our campus, Center for Educational Opportunities, which does also such an amazing job of helping students build community, find community, without having to try to keep up with your roommate, when many times that won't be very fruitful in the end.
Yeah, I would agree as well. I think ultimately the whole aspect of dealing with a sense of belonging, or being able to acclimate into the whole college culture and environment, stems from the student truly understanding as far as what is that makeup of the college overall. And then also being able to connect with individuals that look like them. Being able to form that relationship, and the institution itself that the student is going to, being intentional with ensuring that the staff and the faculty, in a sense, represent the population of the students that they're serving. When it comes ultimately into that student and connecting with that student, and of course it's the myriad of students that we, in a sense, serve, it's truly being able to be relatable, and not necessarily being so high to that student that you feel that you can't touch them or understand their particular situation. I think, and my years of working with students often are able to pick apart that person who is genuine, who genuinely cares and genuinely wants to invest into their future, and generally wants to see them succeed. So in a sense, being able to instill that into, from a leadership aspect down to staff, and having those conversations, what is it truly going to mean to be impactful for every student that you have conversations with? Is it basically even walking down the hall and saying hi to a student, and allowing them to understand that somebody, in a sense, notices them? Often we have students that walk around our campuses, and it's a new environment to them. They're away from their families. They are away from the familiar things, in the sense that they were doing when they were with their high school buddies and family and friends. And now they have to, in a sense, form a new relationship or create new relationships with total strangers. And having folks that's a part of our teams and a part of the whole college community, even within our areas, to be able to connect to them on that level and understand the importance, significance of it, I think is truly one of those things that helps to get over that hump, where students truly feel that they are ingrained and embedded within the culture of the institution.
Yeah, completely agree. I would just add this on. I think that the notion of belonging is both psychological and sociological. I think there is a group ethnicity aspect to it, particularly as I think about our students that are coming from high schools that are very racially and ethnically diverse, and going to colleges in the state of Wisconsin for most which are not. I feel like some of our students go in with an imposter syndrome, feeling like that society has judged them based on what they look like and what group they belong to, maybe how they speak and where their parents came from, and that they have to prove themselves, that any mistake has been magnified, and that there aren't necessarily safe spaces, enough safe spaces for them to go. I think it's important for students to find a real network of real people that they can connect with and feel safe with. And that sometimes takes time, and it takes risk and vulnerability. And it's a skill that you just don't pick up in the middle of a stressful situation. And so whether in having peers that you can rely on and talk to, and a network of adults. And cultivating those relationships is as important as studying in the library, is as important as thinking about your financial future. Those relationships is what's going to allow you to succeed when the rules may not be written clearly or in your favor. So that would be my take.
Thank you all. That was great. I have one more question that I'm going to try to slip in before we come to the very end. So we just have 3 minutes left, but it's 3 minutes that I feel like we still have of you. So another question that we received that it seems like it's a common thread around that trust issue with federal government, with FAFSA, frankly with the banking system. And we see this as as CFS does work, looking at the underbanked or unbanked prevalence within communities of color, and there being just a lot fewer Black-owned banks. And so it's much more difficult to go to a financial institution and see someone or see people who are, look like you and also provide products that are safe and affordable and relevant. And you don't all have to take this question, but whoever feels really passionate or strongly or has a kind of closing thought on it, maybe. What can be done in that sense? Because that is a lot of what could happen with student loan debt, is either, like you said, avoiding taking out student loan debt because of the distrust, or maybe just not wanting to have that debt, or maybe taking out too much, but then not wanting to engage with that financial institution. So if any of you please feel free to speak up. I don't want to have overtalk, but I also don't want to pick on somebody who doesn't want to approach that question. Kimani, do you? Langston, please.
I'll just jump in and say that I think it's a very complex answer that begins with asking communities of color what they need. It needs to start with going to communities of color with people who are trusted in those communities, and starting with the premise that they can self-direct what they need from their environment.
Any other final thoughts on that, Kimani, Jocelyn? Agreed. It is a very complex issue, Langston, and that's I guess food for thought for our closing of this excellent panel. And I do just want to go ahead and thank everyone for taking the time today for this incredibly valuable discussion that we've been able to have, and thank all of those who tuned in. I want to thank Fenaba Addo. I want to thank Catherine Welbeck, Kimani Alford, Jocelyn Diaz-Valdez, and Langston Evans, and of course Laura Sutherland and the group from the coalition, as well as the Urban League of Greater Madison, for all of your help in bringing this webinar event together today. And I will remind everyone that it was recorded, so we will be posting this on our website, along with the slides from Fenaba and Kat, because I know that had a lot of really great kind of visuals and important information as well. And with that, we will close. And again, thank you to everyone. Have a wonderful day.